The night before the hanging arrived without ceremony, settling over the town like a held breath, and in the narrow cell beneath the gallows a man named Jonah Reed sat alone with his boots unlaced and his hat resting on his knees, listening to the wind thread its way through the beams above as if the wood itself were whispering prayers it did not believe in. And Jonah, once called the Red Knife of the Southern Trail, once cursed by mothers and praised by men who loved blood more than truth, found that silence had become heavier than chains, because there was no one left to impress, threaten, or lie to, only the ticking of his own heart and the slow remembering of who he had been before the world carved a monster from his bones. The sheriff had granted him one final night alone, no priest, no guard, no witness, a small mercy offered perhaps out of fear, or perhaps out of the strange respect people sometimes gave to men who survived long enough to earn legends, and Jonah had nodded. When the key turned, not in thanks but in acceptance, because this night was never meant for others, it was meant for the truth he had carried like a hidden wound for 20 years, a truth that did not shout but pressed gently, insistently, asking at last to be spoken before the rope stole his voice. He rose slowly and stepped closer to the iron bars where moonlight spilled across the floor, pale and cold, reminding him of another night long ago when the moon had looked just the same and he had not yet learned how quickly choices harden into fate, and he began to speak, not loudly, not for anyone else, but as if the dark itself were an old friend who deserved honesty, confessing first not to his crimes, which were already etched into wanted posters and tavern songs, but to his fear, the kind no one ever believed he had, the fear of being seen clearly, because Jonah Reed had never been born an outlaw but a quiet ranch boy with careful hands and a voice that trembled when he lied. Raised by a mother who sang while she cooked and a father who believed the world was fair if a man stayed decent, and it was that belief that had shattered the night soldiers rode through their valley chasing a man Jonah had never seen, burning barns to flush out a ghost, and when his father stepped forward with empty hands raised, the shot came fast and careless, and the sound of it still lived behind Jonah's eyes, because something breaks forever when a boy realizes that goodness does not shield you from cruelty, and the law does not always carry justice in its pocket. Jonah told the walls how he buried his father with shaking hands, how his mother stopped singing after that, how silence became the first outlaw he ever met, and how anger arrived later, slow and persuasive, teaching him that survival sometimes wears the face of violence, and that night when he stole his first horse he did not feel wicked, only hollow, like a man stepping into a storm because standing still hurt more. And years passed in dust and gunfire and running, and the name Jonah Reed grew teeth, grew blood, grew a reputation sharp enough to cut through towns before he ever arrived. But beneath it all he carried the memory of a girl named Clara Hale, whose name had never been printed or sung, whose presence had been softer than this wind and stronger than any iron bar, a girl he met while hiding near a riverbank, where she brought bread to a wounded stranger without asking his name, and when she discovered who he was days later, fear crossed her face but did not stay, because Clara had looked at him the way people rarely did, as if the man before her was not finished becoming himself, and Jonah confessed how that look had undone him more deeply than any bullet. How he stayed too long in that valley just to hear her laugh once more, how they spoke in careful half-truths by lantern light, knowing the world would never forgive their closeness, and how he dreamed foolishly of leaving the road, of building something gentle, until the law came riding with torches and shouts, and Jonah ran as he always did, but not before seeing Clara pushed aside, hearing her cry his name, a sound that followed him across deserts and into every bad choice afterward. Because the secret Jonah now poured into the darkness was not that he had loved her, but that he had returned years later under a different name, watching from a distance as she lived on without him, married to a kind man, her smile quieter but real. And that was the moment Jonah knew redemption did not mean being forgiven, it meant stepping away without being seen. And yet the legend kept growing, fed by killings he did not deny but never explained, because some men he shot were not innocent and some were afraid and some were simply in the way, and the truth was messier than the songs, and the blood on his hands was real even if the reasons were never simple. And now, with dawn waiting beyond the hills, Jonah admitted the deepest truth of all, that the crime which earned him this hanging, the ambush that left 3 men dead and made him finally cornered, had been a lie shaped by the law itself, because those men had been the same soldiers who burned his valley, older now, wearing badges instead of uniforms, and Jonah had recognized them by a scar, by a laugh, by the way they held their guns like authority was something to be enforced rather than earned, and when they cornered him in that canyon, intending to kill him and call it justice, Jonah had chosen to stand his ground not for revenge but because running would have meant dying as the legend they wanted, and fighting meant dying as the boy who once believed in fairness, and as he spoke these words into the night, Jonah Reed felt no triumph, only release, because confession was not about changing the past but about loosening its grip, and when the wind grew stronger and the gallows creaked above, he sat back down on his cot, empty now of secrets, knowing the town would wake believing they were ending a monster, never guessing they were silencing a man who had already laid his guns down in his heart, and somewhere beyond the hills Clara Hale would greet the morning unaware that the name she never spoke aloud had finally been set free, and Jonah closed his eyes, breathing in the last hours of darkness, ready at last to meet the light without lies. They said her name the way men spoke of storms they could see coming but could not outrun, in low voices and with glances over their shoulders, because Maribel Crowe, the widow of Red Messer, arrived one late afternoon in a cloud of dust and silence, riding alone with black cloth wrapped tight around her throat despite the heat, her face calm in a way that unsettled the town more than anger ever could, and by nightfall every man in Red Messer remembered the stories they had sworn to forget, stories of outlaws who laughed too loud when she was near, who fought harder for her smile, who swore they would leave the road and never did, and who all ended the same way, laid out cold beneath open skies. Bullets finding them as if drawn by fate itself. No one could say whether Maribel loved them into their graves or whether death simply followed her like a loyal hound, but the result was the same, and so when she rented the small adobe house at the edge of town, the one no family stayed in long because the wind moaned too loudly through its cracks, the townsfolk nodded to one another with uneasy understanding, as if the desert itself had reclaimed something that belonged to it, and Maribel accepted their stares without challenge, unpacking little, speaking less, her movements careful and self-contained, as though she had learned long ago that attachment only taught the world where to aim. She earned her keep sewing, mending, and tending to the sick when no one else would, her hands steady, her voice soft, and even those who feared her name admitted there was a kindness in her that felt worn smooth by grief, like a stone passed from palm to palm over too many years. And yet no man crossed her threshold without reason, because courage faltered where superstition took root, until one evening the sun bled red across the mesas and a body collapsed against her door with a sound more desperate than a knock, and when Maribel opened it she found a man half conscious in the dust, blood darkening his shirt, his revolver fallen from his hand as if even it had given up, and she did not ask his name, because names had power, and power always came at a cost, so she dragged him inside with more strength than her slight frame suggested, closing the door on the watching town and on whatever judgment fate had already begun to pass. She cleaned the wound with practiced care, the bullet lodged near the shoulder but not deep enough to claim his life if treated, and as she worked the man stirred, murmuring apologies to people who were not there, his voice roughened by pain and regret, and Maribel felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the warning she had ignored before, because she recognized this kind of man the way one recognizes a scar on their own body, not by sight but by memory, and when he woke hours later, pale and sweating, he found her seated nearby with a lamp and needle, repairing a torn sleeve as if the night were ordinary, and he tried to rise only to falter, and she told him calmly to stay still, that he was not dying tonight, and something in the certainty of her words broke through his defenses, because Elias Ward, once a feared gunslinger whose name carried weight across 3 territories, had expected death so often it no longer surprised him, but mercy always did. He stayed 3 days, then 4, then a week, as the wound closed slowly under Maribel's care, and during that time the town waited for the other shoe to drop, for the man to be claimed by the pattern everyone believed unbreakable, but instead something quieter unfolded within those adobe walls, conversations shared in low tones when the heat faded, confessions offered without demand, Elias admitting he had been shot running from a job gone wrong, that he had lived too long by the gun and no longer trusted himself to survive without it, and Maribel listening without judgment, because she understood what it meant to carry a life shaped by violence while longing for stillness, and she told him only fragments of her own past, enough to explain the mourning she wore but not enough to invite pity, and in the space between words and understanding grew, not rushed or reckless but slow and aching, the kind that makes 2 people aware of how much they stand to lose, and Elias noticed the way Maribel never flinched at the sound of thunder but tensed when riders passed too slowly, how she touched the locket at her throat when memories crowded too close, and Maribel noticed the way Elias watched the horizon each morning as if measuring how far he might run if he had to, and how his smile, when it came, carried surprise, as though happiness were a stranger he was unsure he recognized. Rumors spread, because they always did, and men whispered that Red Messer was doomed now, that the widow's curse had claimed another soul, and Elias heard enough to confront her one night, asking her directly why people feared her name, and Maribel, tired of hiding from ghosts, finally told him the truth as she knew it, that she had loved 3 men before him, that each had chosen the outlaw life despite her pleas, that each had died by violence not because of her love but because of their refusal to leave the road, and that after the last one she had sworn never to love again. Believing that affection was an invitation fate could not resist, and Elias listened, his face grave, because the story did not frighten him the way it should have, instead it felt like a mirror, and he admitted that if he stayed, trouble would find him, because men from his past were already searching, and Maribel nodded, because she had known this from the moment she saw him bleeding in the dust, and still, when he spoke of leaving at dawn to spare her the weight of another grave, she felt the old heartbreak stir, the kind that arrives not with tears but with a hollow acceptance, and she surprised them both by asking him to stay one more night, not to promise anything, not to defy fate, but simply to sit with her beneath the open sky, and they did, watching the stars burn cold and distant above the mesas, Elias speaking of a childhood he barely remembered, Maribel speaking of the sound of laughter she missed in her own voice, and when his hand brushed hers there was no urgency, only a quiet acknowledgement of what could be and what might never be, and in that moment the town's fear felt very far away. Dawn came too soon, as it always does, and Elias rose to leave, packing his few things, his face set with resolve, because love had taught him something gunfights never had, that courage sometimes meant walking away alive rather than standing your ground, and Maribel watched him from the doorway, her expression composed, refusing to beg, because love, she believed, should never be a chain, and just as Elias mounted his horse, riders appeared on the ridge, silhouettes sharp against the rising sun, men who recognized him despite the distance, men who would not allow him to vanish quietly, and Elias understood then that fate was not done weaving its cruel patterns, and he turned back to Maribel, telling her to run inside, but she did not move, because she had stood in doorways like this before, and she would not hide from what had come, and the gunfire that followed was fast and final, echoing across Red Mesa like a verdict already decided, and when the dust settled, Elias lay wounded again, this time beyond her help, his breath shallow, his eyes clear as he reached for her hand and whispered that he was sorry for bringing the storm to her door, and Maribel held him, tears falling at last, not from shock but from the deep, familiar ache of loss, and she told him softly that loving him had not been a mistake, that even a short peace was worth the price, and when he was gone the riders left as quickly as they had come, leaving behind silence and a town that pretended surprise, and days later Maribel buried Elias beneath a lone mesquite tree, marking the grave with no name, because names only invited ghosts, and she returned to her quiet house at the edge of Red Mesa, carrying her grief like a well-worn shawl, aware that the stories would grow darker now, that her legend would sharpen, but also knowing a truth no one else would ever claim, that love had not killed the men she buried, the world had, and though fate continued to circle her like a vulture, she would not stop opening her door to the wounded, because to do otherwise would mean letting fear win, and beneath the burning western sun, the widow of Red Mesa remained, tragic, resilient, and heartbreakingly alive. Deadwood Crossing had forgotten the sound of order long before it forgot the sound of gunfire, and when Thomas Hale rode into town beneath a sky the color of old iron, no one mistook him for salvation, because he sat his horse like a man already tired of arriving, his coat worn thin at the elbows, his hat pulled low not from mystery but from habit, and pinned to his chest was a badge dulled by years of dust and regret, a badge he had sworn he would never wear again. Yet here he was, crossing the line where the road narrowed and the buildings leaned inward as if the town itself were closing its fists, and the people of Deadwood Crossing watched him with the careful eyes of those who had learned that hope was expensive and rarely paid out. The place had once been a stop worth stopping for, a rail spur with a church, a schoolhouse, and a lawman who stayed sober, but those things had slipped away one by one, replaced by protection money, backroom deals, and the rule of the Briggs brothers, men who wore violence like a family name and kept order only so long as it benefited them, and Thomas knew all this before he arrived, because he had not come chasing rumor but memory, drawn back by a letter written in a careful hand that reminded him of who he used to be, a letter from Evelyn Porter, the last schoolteacher who hadn't fled, telling him that Deadwood Crossing was about to tear itself apart and that if there was any piece of the man he once was left, this was where it was needed. Thomas dismounted slowly in front of the empty marshal's office, its door hanging crooked, the jail cells inside long since repurposed as storage or worse, and as his boots hit the dirt, the weight of the badge pressed into his chest like an accusation. because wearing it again meant admitting that the failure he ran from years ago had never loosened its grip, that the faces he saw in his sleep had followed him across every mile of road he thought might outrun them. He had been a good marshal once, or at least a determined one, stationed in a mining town not unlike this, where he believed rules could be enforced evenly and courage would be enough, until the night a gang rode in faster and meaner than expected, and Thomas made the wrong call, choosing to hold the line rather than evacuate, choosing pride over patience. And by dawn the town burned and the woman he loved lay dead beneath the wreckage, her blood on his hands as surely as if he had pulled the trigger himself, and so he quit, left the badge behind, and became a man drifting between jobs that required no judgment, no authority, only silence. Deadwood Crossing did not greet him kindly, because the Briggs brothers noticed everything, and when Thomas walked into the saloon that first night, conversations thinned, cards paused mid-deal, and Luke Briggs, the eldest, smiled like a man pleased to see entertainment arrive, asking politely whether Thomas planned to stay long, and Thomas answered just as politely that he had business to settle, and something in his voice, quiet and unyielding, caused Luke's smile to tighten, because men who had nothing left to lose were always the most dangerous, and the town felt it too, a subtle shift, as if a long-dormant nerve had been touched. Over the next days Thomas set about doing what little could be done, fixing the jail door, posting notices no one read, breaking up small disputes without drawing his gun, and each action drew a line, faint but visible, between what Deadwood Crossing was and what it might be again, and people responded cautiously, some with gratitude, some with fear, because siding with law meant inviting attention from men who punished loyalty harshly, and Thomas did not ask them to stand with him, because he remembered too well the cost of asking others to share a burden they did not choose, but he found unexpected strength in Evelyn Porter, whose calm resolve reminded him that bravery did not always wear spurs, and in Samuel Pike, a former rail hand with a limp and a steady aim, and in a handful of townsfolk who decided that living afraid was its own kind of death. The Briggs brothers escalated slowly, testing boundaries, pushing Thomas to react, and each time he responded measured, deliberate, refusing to be provoked into the kind of violence that would justify open war, because he knew how easily blood invited more blood. And yet the town was already preparing, men oiling old rifles, women packing valuables as if expecting fire, and at night Thomas sat alone in the marshal's office, the badge heavy against his chest, replaying the past, hearing the screams he failed to stop, questioning whether this return was penance or pride wearing a different face. The breaking point came when the Briggs brothers dragged Samuel Pike into the street at dawn, accusing him of aiding the marshal, beating him not to kill but to humiliate, and Thomas stepped out onto the boardwalk, hands visible, heart pounding with the memory of another street, another choice, and this time he did not rush, did not draw, did not shout, but spoke clearly, naming the brothers' crimes, offering himself in Samuel's place, a gesture that stunned the watching town and infuriated Luke Briggs, because control depended on fear, and fear faltered when a man stood unafraid, and the gunfire that followed was chaotic and brief, a spark catching dry kindling, and when it ended 2 of the Briggs brothers lay wounded, 1 dead, and Thomas stood shaking but alive, having chosen restraint until it mattered and action when there was no other choice. The town held its breath in the aftermath, knowing retaliation would come swift and merciless, and Thomas prepared for war not with speeches but with quiet instructions, positioning, and the hard-earned wisdom that came from past failure, evacuating those who could leave, fortifying what could be held. And when the remaining Briggs forces rode in at sunset, expecting an easy reckoning, they found resistance disciplined and unified, not heroic in the way songs would later claim but desperate and human, men and women fighting not for glory but for the right to wake up without fear, and Thomas moved through the chaos with grim focus, each decision weighed against the lives depending on it, the ghosts of his past whispering but no longer commanding, and when the last shots faded and the riders withdrew, leaving Deadwood Crossing battered but standing, Thomas sank to his knees in the dirt, exhausted, grief and relief tangled together, because victory did not erase loss, it only gave it meaning, and as dawn broke over a town that might finally heal, Thomas Hale remained marshal not because he wanted redemption but because he understood now that wearing the badge was not about proving oneself worthy of the past, it was about staying present for the future, and though the road ahead promised hardship, he faced it with steady eyes, having learned at last that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand anyway when running would be easier, and in Deadwood Crossing, Law had returned not as an ideal, but as a man who refused to fail the same way twice. Black Canyon was a place the sun seemed to avoid lingering over, a deep scar cut into the earth where shadows clung long after dawn and the wind carried sounds that never quite formed words, and it was here that men swore the devil himself had buried his gold, not as a gift, but as a test no soul had ever passed, because those who searched for it either vanished into the stone or returned hollow-eyed, speaking of whispers that followed them even into sleep, and Silas Mercer had heard every one of those stories before he ever touched the map, but desperation has a way of dulling fear, especially in a man who has already lost everything that once anchored him to reason. Silas had been a prospector for most of his life, drifting from claim to claim with more hope than luck, until a cave-in took his partner and best friend, leaving Silas with a broken leg, a scarred conscience, and a debt he could never repay, and when the saloon owner in a nameless desert town slid a brittle piece of parchment across the table in exchange for one last drink Silas could not afford, he felt fate tighten its grip, because the map was old, drawn in a careful hand with markings that pointed unmistakably toward Black Canyon, and scrawled at the bottom in faded ink were the words, "Take only what you can carry, and carry the cost," and Silas laughed then, a dry sound, because warnings meant little to a man already ruined, and so he packed his mule, bought supplies on credit he never intended to honor, and set out across the desert under a sky too wide to care whether he lived or died. The whispers began on the second night, faint at first, like wind threading through rocks, calling his name though no one alive knew it well enough to use it gently, and Silas told himself it was thirst, or guilt, or memory, because men often heard ghosts when alone long enough, but the voices grew clearer as he neared the canyon, promising warmth, relief, and gold enough to wash away every mistake he had ever made, and when he reached the canyon's edge at dusk and looked down into its depths, the air felt heavier, charged, as if the land itself were waiting to see whether he would step forward or turn back, and Silas hesitated only a moment before descending, because hope, even poisoned hope, was still hope. Days passed in the canyon's twisting corridors, where sunlight arrived thin and late, and Silas followed the map deeper, finding old tools half buried in stone, bones picked clean by time, and markings scratched into walls that looked less like words and more like warnings made by men who had lost the ability to explain what they feared. And at night the whispers gathered close, no longer content to call his name but reminding him of every failure, every selfish choice, every moment he had turned away when help was needed, until sleep became a battlefield. He rarely won, and yet with each step the promise of gold burned brighter, a pull that felt less like greed and more like destiny, as though the canyon itself had chosen him. When Silas finally found the vein, hidden behind a narrow rockfall just as the map promised, it glimmered in the low light like captured fire, thick seams of gold threading through dark stone, more wealth than he had ever imagined, and he fell to his knees laughing and crying all at once, convinced that suffering had finally been repaid, and as he chipped away at the stone with shaking hands, the whispers fell silent, quiet so complete it rang in his ears, and in that silence Silas felt watched, not by eyes but by something older, something patient. He loaded his pack until it strained, ignoring the ache in his back and the warning carved into the map, because restraint had never been his strength, and as he turned to leave the cavern, the canyon groaned, a low sound like a breath drawn too deep, and the whispers returned, no longer coaxing but demanding, reminding him that bargains, once accepted, could not be renegotiated, and Silas stumbled back through the twisting paths, his mule spooked and restless, the shadows seeming to shift where no light changed. And the farther he went the heavier the gold felt, not just on his shoulders but in his thoughts, filling them with suspicion and dread, and he began to see shapes in the corners of his vision, figures that vanished when faced directly, and hear footsteps echoing his own, and when he finally emerged from the canyon at dawn, the relief was so sharp it brought him to tears, but the desert beyond felt wrong, stretched and unfamiliar, as if distance itself had learned new rules, and the whispers followed him there too, promising that once he reached town the voices would fade, the price paid in fear alone. Days later, Silas staggered into a settlement that should have been familiar but wasn't. The buildings too new, the faces too young, and when he asked for water the townsfolk stared at him as though he had risen from the dead, and an old woman finally told him that the town he named had burned down 30 years earlier, that no one named Silas Mercer had been seen since the cave-in that killed his partner, and Silas laughed in denial until he saw his reflection in a window, older than he remembered, his hair gone grey, his eyes carrying decades of exhaustion he did not recall earning, and the gold in his pack suddenly felt cold, and when he opened it the metal inside looked dull, heavy, more like stone than treasure, and the whispers, now cruel, explained the price at last, that Black Canyon did not trade in gold for men's labor, but in time, memory, and soul. that the wealth he carried was paid for with years stolen from his life, and the rest would be collected soon. Silas fled the town in terror, but the desert stretched endlessly, and with every step his body weakened, his thoughts frayed, and the gold grew heavier still, until at last he collapsed beneath a merciless sun, the whispers fading into a satisfied hush as the desert reclaimed what had been borrowed, and travelers who later found the canyon spoke of a skeleton clutching a pack of worthless stone, its jaw frozen open as if mid-confession, and the legend of the devil's gold grew darker, not because of the riches it promised, but because of the quiet truth it revealed, that the canyon did not curse men for wanting more, it cursed them for believing they could take without paying, and deep within Black Canyon, beneath stone and shadow, the gold waited still, patient and gleaming, ready for the next desperate soul to listen when the whispers began.